In the video today, I'll try to walk you through what a new dictatorship looks like. What is the Schmittian ideal of the Caesar from a juridical point of view? So we know a lot about how Spengler viewed the Caesar from a morphological form, how it takes shape over the course of history. We go from having this anarchic, we could call despotism from the bottom, the idea of democracy and how all these small people are influencing history in positive ways, but we know this shatters at some point and becomes a meaningless quagmire of certain people wanting everything and then certain other people wanting the opposite of everything that other person wants, and then this dissolution basically of the power structure, and out of the ashes, like a phoenix, rises the Caesar type, this dictator. Dictatorship, though, is a very familiar term for us in ways that probably is now meaningless to the form it will actually take. And that's, how does a legal construct of and this is specifically an executive, so the sovereign, take form and shape, and that the idea of a dictator, as maybe historically we think about tyrannical and draconian policies enacted by some despot at their own whims, is much more around how is a power structure funneled from the top downwards onto very few layers as opposed to many, many layers. And this can still make sense in relation to having a constitution. It doesn't have to be a legal structure or framework. It can actually be something whereby we continue to coexist with normative legal structures, but the technicalities around how they're implemented will be fundamentally changed in many ways. So this goes into a larger and broader point that Schmitt had, which is that during the 17th and 18th centuries, we transformed from what was rulership to reigning. So the heads of state, and you can see just a little diagram here of the European monarchs at the time, they went from being absolute monarchic claimants to the thrones and very much rulers in that they would dictate certain things with their edicts and they would be obeyed almost without question. And then conflict only arose between the estates. And so you could have up to 4 estates, and the first 2 estates were the knightly and priestly classes, the third estate being the merchant class, and the fourth estate being the peasant mass, now urbanized labor class. But the idea that the estates would have conflicts which would counteract the monarch, and the absolute monarchy reigned in a way that it had final decision-making sovereignty over everyone else. But this faded away in the dissemination of the idea that democracy, or at least rule by the mob, was the sought after premise. It was, let's now actually have our lives dictated by everybody so that we all get a say, which obviously is meaningless. None of us get a say now, because the way that committee decision making works is exactly that. Pointless discussions which go round and round, and then there's always a compromise decision which feels very ineffectual and nugatory in many ways. So for us, it's always the case that we understand the shift in power to go from something where there's a supreme or supremacy to it, to something where there's an unsure, or at least a lethargic, dissolute and ill-equipped committee-style decision-making process. And this is always and never is the case. It's always the case of dysfunction to a large degree, and bureaucracy in the nth degree. You can bureaucratize almost every single facet of modern society just for the sheer fact that decision-making becomes a burden. No one wants to be wrong. The moral and ethical contributions to rulership becomes too much and unappealing, and thus you abrogate away from those positions of power to someone else. So you say, I want the good stuff about this position. All the bad stuff can be fed to one of my minions, underlings, etc., 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 until the nth degree of, now my underling just performs a task which they're unquestioning about because they consider it a dictate from their superior. But the idea that this has always been the case is wrong, and that we have had monarchs is very much well established. But it also goes into why we're now transitioning away from what was that, as I said before, rule to reign. So there was a reigning monarch, and reigning monarchs don't actually have much in the way of appeal, nor do they have much sway in the way of power. Because when you transition out of the decision maker being the sovereign, being the executive, ostensible executive, so you demarcate certain legal and juridical powers. So you say, look, now we're going to separate what is the head of state from the parliament or the function or the executive. And so you were saying that, no, we have a queen or a king, but we also have a prime minister or a president or well, it can't be president, but a prime minister usually, or a chancellor or something, where the power is now vested in those people to actually make decisions from a governance perspective. And the king now is just the regal trophy boy. He doesn't actually perform tasks, he owns properties and he administers those, but in general, from a political standpoint, he's now been denuded. He's been neutered in a very, very real sense. He's taken all his power away and now he's a nobody, except in name only. And this can be seen even just in this historical graph here, where you go from ruling houses and long lines and lineages of power brokers and men who were sovereigns in every single way, to unknowable nobodies. So if you take just even a look and a glance at, say, the heads of state, and this is particularly for the European monarchs post the start of the 20th century, so anyone from 1900 through to, say, now, very few will be able to name the king or queen or whomever the region is of each state that they would have been familiar with 200 years ago. And they can also not really label or list the exact tasks and the prerogative of that person. What is it that they function as? They're just a greeting committee for foreign diplomats, but basically they bestow honours on people and then hang around all day. There's not too much to what they do from a sovereign perspective, but from a legal and governance perspective. So you lost all the luster that it was associated to these positions via the mechanisms which drain away, siphon out power from them to somewhere else. So this power is always concentrated. It's just not now concentrated in what we thought of as the ruler. It's actually now in this committee of partisan anarchy, which Schmitt calls it. So this is the first move, you could say. And so in the 18th, 19th centuries, we moved into this democracy phase where we have this partisan anarchy. We have the ability for money to buy and influence politics much more readily. As I said before, you move out of these, which estates are influencing power starts to change. You have the bourgeois and the petit bourgeois and the proletariat now being much more players of significance in politics. And this is not accidental, this is just an instrument of how power works, that it takes different forms, but it continues and maintains a certain level of manipulation. So you can always understand how it's manipulated by someone and interacted with by the others. And this can go into the Max Weber typology of power, where we say what is the use of how power functions and it manifests. And in many ways, it's just a legal instrument. We just say, like, this is the power rod. If you are the holder of the power rod, you make the decisions. That can be the basics of some of that form of power. Some of it comes in, as he rightly diagnoses, something like charisma, but then there's also other elements to it around tradition. And tradition in this case, obviously you can see that there's no traditional form strong enough to withstand and outlast what was democracy. Almost every single state here has lost their ruler to be just reigning, and the reigning monarch is impotent and pointless. And so we move into the administration phase from the reigning stage. So once they've gone from reigning over the people, which implies at least an interaction that's not as significant, doesn't carry as much weight and as much power, the administrative phase is the most impotent version. Then it is just the most banal, the most perfunctory, by and by doing tasks which perform outcomes that have been associated with a system and with a process and with a schema. We've designed them so they're very most rational and analytical as possible. To what degree is stated, and obviously it's expounded in ways that are constitutionalized. So we write them down and we say, look, now this is how everyone behaves according to what are now the statutes with the limitations, what those implications are from a legal and juridical perspective, and now we go from there. And this is how Schmitt does come into this. But I'll start with a quote here from Hour of Decision so we can get the morphological view from the Spengler perspective. He writes, "This condition of things is the anarchic intermezzo known today as democracy, which leads from the destruction of monarchical state supremacy by way of political plebeian rationalism to the Caesarism of the future. There are already signs in the dictatorial tendencies of our time of this Caesarism, which is destined to assume the unlimited mastery over the ruins of historical tradition." And instinctively, Spengler knows, and that's just as the takeaway from morphological history, as the understanding and the tradition of history as a experience rather than as a science. You see these same types of people emerge, and this happens particularly in the Caesar phase by men of great blood, and this means legally that we will start to see dictators in the West who actually conform to existing structures but perform or outperform what were traditional measures of administration and go back to being ruled. Now, we are not used to ruling. You can see this with what we consider the despots or the dictators of our time, and we can point to benevolent ones like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore or maleficent ones like Putin in Russia. We consider, oh, look at this guy who's performing all these malodorous tasks obstreperously. But what we really consider here is much more around his power and how it functions, and that we just don't like the way he does things, which is not ipso facto evil. It's just the alienness of it to us. We just don't understand it, and therefore ascribe it to be, or intimate at least, that it's an immoral act. He's an immoral actor. So Schmitt here, he goes on to say, and this is much more around the general form of dictators and how it looks. Nevertheless, they remain, even for Klapmar, the same general entitlement to do whatever is demanded by the concrete situation. In other words, something by definition unlimited. Seemingly, the right of exception is still lawful, because it appears to have a limitation in the exception itself. But in truth, the question of sovereignty is exactly the same as the one of iora extraordinaria. The state, shattered as it is by its estates and class struggles, is its constitution, by reason of the continuous state of exception in it, and its laws is, to the core, the law of exception. Whoever rules over the state of exception therefore rules over the state, because he decides when this state should emerge and by what means are necessary. So you can see here that, and obviously if anyone's familiar with Schmitt, you know that he is obsessive about this idea of the extreme, the scenarios that induce us to understand what a person who's an actor has in terms of both power, delineation of the responsibilities and role that they have, and how exactly they enforce that upon us, and whether we obey. These are the interesting parts for him, because they start to, as you said before, demarcate the sphere of the governance of this power ship. So if you then take what are new circumstances, and we say, look, something really weird has happened, the Ukraine is embroiled in a war, what are you going to do? Because there's no process for this, there's no stipulation around you should and must do this, then someone has to decide in this interaction what to do, and by doing that thing, they become the sovereign. If you allow for Congress and Senate to make that decision, you're bestowing upon them the power in that way that they've now become sovereign. Obviously, that's not true for Trump. In Trump's case, he doesn't do that. He doesn't say, you can now make the decision. I want to make the decision. I'm the sovereign. I'll be making the exception, the rule to the exceptions. And this is how you can come about understanding what the idea of a dictator is. It's the man who starts to take all the decisions, but they're still grounded. They're still based in legal structure. It isn't some despot in a third world country who's going around doing coups and overthrowing local militia and massacring civilians. This is not what a dictator is in a legal distinction. We need to very much understand that this is much more around an executive sovereign. And it goes back into being a ruler. Rulers in the past, historically, have had the ability to wage wars, and they have done so. And they've also massacred people. It's not like that's out of the realms of historical reality, but it's much more around how do we interact with the idea of having a ruler over us who actually imposes things upon us again. We're not used to it, so it is going to be an unfamiliar feeling. It is not going to be something that we really like. Now, this kind of nature of governance goes into the modern discourse quite a lot, because you see the visage of it amongst our modern punditry and commentary. And this is taken up by I don't call him a dunderhead, someone who's a maybe pseudo-intellectual crypto wonk like Curtis Yavin, who is very, very big on the idea that you can explain away structure and power through historical examples, as well as associate them to new forms in ways that just are similar to but not synonymous with the actuality. So he likes to paint pictures where his answer sounds very smart and also represents something that he wants. This is that painting a premise to suit an ideal, and the logos of it will flow through necessarily so. I can set up any arrangement, a pre-arrangement of, I have these presuppositions and it goes into my argument, and at the back end comes what I want to be as the natural conclusion. This is how he presents things to you. And this is why it sounds he's very rational, and because he almost sounds like a contrarian. People are attached to what is someone who is perceived as being heterodox, but also astutely heterodox, and has this perspicacity to him. But in relation to the reality, he's quite far wrong, because he basically glozes many of the most important factors that go into power structures and how actual governance in the Western Faustian society will be, not ought to be, not should be, not could. It's the what will it look like that he misses completely. But then also his delivery is just shoddy. He likes to, tergiversate around a lot of these ideas in that way. So Schmitt here, maybe that's as an aside, but the real crux of this to him is that there is no idea of legality in what he's saying. His background, I don't know if it's legal or not, but it belies a certain, if not daft, but decrepitude around legal understandings. You have to base what is decision making in historical fact, and because we are Germanic, the way that we like law to look is based on this common law, but this idea that there are precedencies around what's able to be done. And as I said, then in comes this exception, the idea that something new has happened and we have to relate it back to something. It's always going to be the continuation of and the general directional truth. You're making decisions which are based on your own rationality, but the rationality is tied into your own blood feeling. So Trump will make decisions which are based on Trump logic, and people won't like it necessarily universally, but it's not supposed to be. Germanic chieftains have always made decisions and advocated for certain things as an executive, as this dictatorial power. That's just the way that it works. And then we lump it, or like it, and then post facto rationalize through into a legal structure. Then if anything happens that's very similar or synonymous to this, we're going to have the same ruling, and now it's very easy to understand and follow these things. So you can trace the course of legal history and political history very concomitant to one another. So in general, that's how we should start to think about it. His idea, this is Curtis Yavin, of the CEO type of governance, and he calls it monarchy or something stupid, lacks its grounding first legally, because if you take a company, most of them have boards. Boards are the representative of the shareholders, but now you're talking about a derivative of shareholders. Boards aren't shareholders per se. They can be, but they're usually representatives of, and they're thus a derivative of a larger, more disassembled group of random people in this anarchic fashion. How do you rule over them? Or you just reduce the amount of decisions into few, and then the few then deliberate and then come up with their own decisions, which actually probably are abstracted so far away that they're not reflecting the general consensus of certain things. How is that CEO going to be told what to do by those people when it's almost inverse to how he perceives the power structure? The CEO is on the bottom here in a board structure, shareholders at the top, board members, and then a CEO. So in his mind, I think he's like, no, CEO, that's the top. I was a CEO, I made all the decisions. But maybe in a company that you own, but politics is not like that. Politics cannot be run like that. You need to do away with shareholders in a way that inverses that pyramid, and you do that by becoming the strong man. The Caesar doesn't have a pyramid above him, inverse pyramid above him of more people than him. He rules down. So Curtis Yavin is obviously moronic around this. He just doesn't understand. But then also, legally it doesn't make sense, because we have a constitution, America, and you would have to understand what the absolutist version of this is. If you're an absolutionist in the monarchical sense, and you say, look, I have absolute control, every single extreme scenario is, and a banal scenario is always interacted through me, and I'm some sort of a portal to decision making. Everything is input, and then it's out of me output. I am the filtration process. It's not functional, it's not feasible, and it's just nonsensical. We don't need an absolute monarch. We will get a Caesar, and the Caesars will continue to reign as they see fit. And that's not limiting themselves to certain boundaries, but it's also not setting those boundaries to be permanent, and this state of flux of some Caesars will want to govern a lot, some will not want to govern at all. So you have this idea that there's a leader type who will just rule. They'll rule as they see best fit. And that's what we'll get. It's a living organic process. It's experience. It's not some pre-formulated scripture that he's going to be able to hand down to anybody. So there's a long-winded way of saying why Curtis Yalvin's retarded, but that is the way that his argument falls flat. It's just stupidity manifest. So that's the first thing I think about that. The second part here is around how Schmitt starts to transform the idea of dictatorship from the existing structures. He says, this orientation towards dictatorship, an orientation consisting of the three elements of rationalism, technicality, and the executive, is at the origins of the modern state. The word dictatorship is used here to designate a kind of commandment that, by definition, is not dependent upon any agreement or insight of the party being addressed, and does not wait for his/her acceptance, which we can see as, you could call, the fundamentals, the essentials, the basics of why do we have dictatorship? How is it possible to have a dictatorship in a modern age where we have the idea of democracy and that, no, there's an election cycle and we'll have a new prime minister, we'll have a new president, we'll have a new chancellor, they're all recycled through, and in 50 years we'll forget who they were, because that's how it works. At this rate and at this stage, no one is forgetting Trump within the next 50 years as we've forgotten. And you can say, no, I remember every president back to 1850. You are not the normal person. The normal person will not be able to continue to memorize all these presidents' names because they're just not impactful. They're just not necessary. It's not necessary to understand who was president between Reagan and Obama. It just isn't. There was not that much that happened. There was not that much meaningfulness to it. It just isn't something that's worth bothering with. And so when we start to understand that the morphological forms are only impactful and important in certain ways, there were still important people other than Caesar in the Roman age, and we remember them as Crassus or Cato or whoever. But it is also the case that the Caesar was the most important person, and not every Caesar was as important as every other Caesar. So there's a hierarchy here of both importance and memory, but that goes into this greatness factor. And that goes into what Schmitt has assigned here as the executive. You have the other two, which is rationalism, and this is maybe best dealt with as a praxeological rationalism. The Austrian School of Economics comprised this idea of praxeology, which basically is everything we do is for a purpose, and I find that to be the best pragmatic realism around the idea of rationalism. Rationalism just is applying logic to certain premises to achieve outcomes, and there's nothing really else to that. We tend to think of ourselves always as being rational, so it's not meaningless, but it's very perfunctory, or it's very much at least the established norm. And then so the second and last point here around technicality is just how things work. It's the techniques of governance, and you can see the transformation of the word technic in that to mean either technology, which is the process of how we construct our ability to achieve outcomes that we normally would, or the technicality of something, which is just the process of, so the human interaction and action of something. The technicality of doing mathematics versus the computer doing mathematics are both the same. There's the technology enhances one, and we're just responsible for the other. But these two things are not synonymous, but you could say distinguished without difference. Then the point then, I suppose, which is the executive part, the most important part, and that's how we'll arrive at that, is because we're already at the stage where Caesars make sense. They come to us in an age of exhaustion. No one really likes democracy. Once boomers drop off the perch, we will start to understand that they were clamoring for, or at least clawing to death on, this idea that democracy was the peak of civilization. It was the ne plus ultra of living from a governance perspective. Everyone got their say, everyone got their fair share. We were all equitable. We had egalitarian and all of this garbage, because the most rapacious of them obviously proved this to be wrong, and the most lecherous and the lascivious obviously proved this to be wrong. So there is no equality here. We were sold something that was never true, basically indoctrinated into that Weltanschauung. But I think now then it's important for us to hopefully wrap this up, this long-winded way of me outlining the premises here around the dictatorship and how it will form, because I think there's a lot to be said of Caesarism in general. It's a very fascinating concept, and we're also living through it, so it's the most pertinent morphological discussion we can probably have and will have for the next 100 years. But it is to say that the wind blows the ship directionally, but you'll still have a captain to steer. So we can think of ourselves as the wind. Now, unless you are a Caesar, you will become one. We're hoping here that we're able to conjure up and out of the soil a few great last Teutonic Caesars. Then what is it that you can think of yourself as being the wind, and at some point maybe the captain? So understand that there's a historical direction to things. You won't get a complete flip of the compass without severe catalyzation of that. And so when you have this idea that there's a directional pull to certain things, it's best to go with it to a certain degree, but understand that you can still steer and manipulate these things into maybe alternate ways. Goes against maybe the understanding that there's a way to accelerate or decelerate certain morphological historical forms. It's just not possible. And it's also to say that you can't completely inverse the direction, or you can't do away with and abolish certain things without having power as it is. And even in doing so, you saw it through Rome, that they never really disestablished certain proceedings or legislative bodies, or you could call them sentimental holdovers. We've grandfathered in almost everything that's representative, symbolic of what was Rome historically. We've just now completely changed the definition of it. And this is how you can see that happen. We can do it with socialism, we can do it with dictators, we can do it with almost everything except the spiritual Faustian will to power, infinite power. So I think maybe wrapping up here with just another Spengler quote from our decision, where he says about Caesar's, but what he lacked, and he's talking about Julius Caesar here, what he lacked, his nephew Caesar possessed, and in full measure. He brought the terrible period of the revolution to an end by his form of dictatorship from above, which set the unlimited authority of a superior personality in the place of partisan anarchy. It was a form to which he gave his name for all time. His murder and its consequences could not affect it in any way. From this reign onward, the struggle is waged no longer for gold or to gratify class hatred, but solely for the possession of absolute power. So this is the final understanding that we'll get to. Caesars just are. They're men who will perceive themselves as certain things, and at their whims we will probably have to manifest certain outcomes. And this is that concrete and the very real realization of a Caesar and what that means for us here in this time period. They're going to define themselves by their boundaries, and their greatness will be correspondent to their goals and whether they achieve them or not. And that's, as I said before, really the only focus you should have is how do I become, if not the wind, to direct the Caesar, then the Caesar himself.